listening to the Straight to Video podcast with Rob Lane.
What's up, everyone? Hope you're well, and thank you as always for choosing to listen to my Straight to Video podcast. So today I bring you a first in almost 300 episodes, as I have my first archaeologist on the show. So how do I end up knowing someone from the archaeology world, other than the great Indiana Jones, of course? Well, me and my buddy James Wright, who is today's guest, go way back over 20 years from in and around the Nottingham music scene. So whilst I'm still with my head in the clouds, somewhat trying to do something in music, James has since been carving his own incredible journey in the world of historic buildings, and even appearing on TV shows such as Time Team and The Great British Dig, alongside some of our TV heroes. We both met in the early 2000s when there was a real buzz about music in and around Nottingham. It looked for a short while that glam rock was really going to bounce back, and for me being in bands and James and his wife Michelle working hard to promote these bands with Riot Promotions, things were pretty damn exciting, and we all look back on it very fondly. Today, James is getting ready to head out on an 80-plus date book tour with his new book, Historic Buildings Mythbusting, which starts in June, and during our chat, we tried to pretty much cover it all, from how he got into archaeology, the twists and turns of both that career and his time as a promoter, but also how he's still very active in music, but in a slightly different way, working with the Music Venues Properties campaign. As we would most likely describe things in the past, it's a bit of a shambles, but a great fun conversation, no doubt. As always, this Straight to Video podcast is proudly presented to you in association with Affinity Photo, an incredible piece of photo editing software which I've been using for graphic design the past couple of years. Affinity Photo is used to create the podcast episode artwork you see each week, and it's an extremely affordable alternative to other programs on the market, so please check them out at affinity.serif.com. Alright, let's do this. As mentioned, James is going to be all over the country promoting his new book, Historic Buildings Mythbusting, and all dates along with how to order the book can be found at thehistorypress.co.uk, and be sure to follow James on Twitter or X at JPW Archaeology. But right now, please enjoy my Straight to Video chat with my pal, James Wright.
I'm back. I'd lost track of Michelle. I couldn't find her. I couldn't, I couldn't let him go downstairs until I knew where she was.
Where was she?
She was in the garden with the door shut. So
Mint.
yeah, there we go. All good.
Good to see you, mate.
Yeah, you too.
I'm stoked we got to do this. Very, very cool.
I was really surprised when you asked us,
Don't be daft.
because of the nature of the podcast. When I saw you at Bullet Boys the other week, I was sort of saying, it would be a welcome opportunity to talk about the old music days as well. But because I was doing the archaeology through that too, there's kind of a chronological link, if you know what I mean. So we can talk about both. It's going to be unusual for your listeners to want to listen to some guy talk about archaeology for 45 minutes. But, I suppose there's the Indiana Jones link.
Mate, you're spoiling my questions. God damn it. So I was trying to think when we very first connected, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you reached out to me when I started Trash Pit Magazine around 2003, 2004, and you wanted to submit some photos and reviews. Does that sound about right, or would there have been something before then?
The timing in the story with Trash Pit Magazine is right, but I had met you a little bit before that anyway. And I think because I'd already met you a couple of times was when I thought, well, I'd like to do some writing about music. I thought, well, I know this guy, so I'll contact him.
Because this was pre-TCC, so this must have been Dip.
Dip, yeah. So your old band Dip had been doing some gigs with Robin Black and the Intergalactic Rockstars, who Michelle, my wife, and I had been running their street team. And I met a whole group of characters, many of whom I'm still friends with to this day. And I think actually you and Michelle had connected first. And then when we were talking about, I'd like to do some writing about music as well as sort of helping with the grassroots promotion, I considered the idea of contacting you and ended up writing for Trash Pit for about 3 years, something like that.
Definitely.
Various interviews and reviews. At the same time, almost exactly the same time, I'd met Alison from Bubblegum Slut as well. So I ended up writing for the two of you, but always trying to keep the content separate. So not submitting the same review twice or anything like that, self-plagiarizing. But yeah, just trying to keep the content as varied, but also because her fanzine, there was some crossover with the whole trashy, sleazy rock, but hers took it in a more indie direction as well, a more glitter direction, whereas yours was maybe going more towards the hard rock end of things. So because I was interested in both types of music, I was able to sort of feel that I could offer different angles for the two magazines. I think also Alison's did a bit more of the whole goth industrial thing as well, so that kind of appealed to me. Yeah, I'd always written, I'd always enjoyed writing, and I wanted to turn that towards music. So yeah, I think it would be 2003, certainly 4, when we first started spending a bit of time together. And then, of course, you started Teenage Casket Company, and I think I even reviewed that probably for Bubblegum Slut, actually.
Yeah, I think that was our first official review.
It is interesting, though, listening to, and I still do this on occasion, I've got a big box of floppy cover CDs, which are all the demos of the bands that I used to work with that I've kept. And it's people like yourselves, Drug Dealer, The Cheerleader, The Pleasures, some AC Slade stuff as well. And listening to those really early recordings is so illuminating sometimes in comparison to what happened later. You know, they're not necessarily demos, but they're those sort of homemade singles or EPs that maybe the songs then went on to get rewritten or the sound developed and that kind of thing. You can really sense that with some of the Disarm recordings as well, the South Yorkshire band, where you can really get a sense of a band growing even across just like 18 months. From their first ideas that they felt okay to take out of the rehearsal room into a recording studio that maybe was still really rough and raw, but they were obviously really eager to release into the world. And because this was the boom period really for home recording and for burning your own CDs and then printing up your own covers and out you go, the very DIY approach, I've still managed to keep a lot of those. Some of them are unfortunately no longer playable, but I've certainly got the artwork to look at and all that kind of thing. And I really enjoy that kind of idea of almost cataloguing and looking at the chronology of a band and how they develop over time. So those early recordings, I think, for all of those bands that I work with, some of whom are still going, some of whom are still quite successful. Not just a nostalgia piece for me, it's actually a way of understanding the development of a band.
That's interesting you say it was the time of like burning your own CDs and some of them don't work. I think a lot of people are finding that with the old CDRs. They're putting in like, fucking hell, it don't work anymore. Shit.
Yeah.
That song's gone.
Yeah, I was listening to the Plastic Toys, who were a great band. They had that indie glitter industrial mixer fronted by John Tufnell. They were a pretty hard-working band, sort of Southampton, Winchester area. And I really enjoyed their early demos. And then their album was really good. For One Night Only was excellent.
He was a rock star, man.
Proper, looked brilliant and still does, to be honest with you. But they had like one of the greatest opening lines of any album ever, which is, last night I fucked your girlfriend, tore your whole world down. And it's just the way he delivers it in such a punchy, aggressive way, which is not what he's like as a guy at all. John's such a great bloke. He's sort of really mild-mannered. He likes a pint of mild, The Guardian and Radio 4. He's really quite quiet and, you know, not a party animal anyway. So this really intense opening line, it just blows you away. Anyway, I was listening to some of that early stuff, but some of the early demos, I just can't get it to play. And it's one of those things where you're sort of going round your house and seeing, well, what devices have I got that might play this? I've got an old laptop with a CD drive in it. No, don't play on that.
You can hear it spinning for ages. It's going to find it eventually.
Yeah. Trying to get it on various stereos, not working on it. Eventually got a bit of it to work on my DVD player, which was obscure. But yeah, so it's worth revisiting that. One of the reasons really for mentioning Plastic Toys and that, apart from watching the development of that band, is actually watching the development of the artist as well, because John is still a performing musician in a way that many people from those days aren't really in a meaningful sense. But he went on to front a successor band, which almost felt like the next step of Plastic Toys, but they just changed the name, called the Lost Souls Club. I think they did a couple of EPs. And then that kind of morphed into St. Agnes, which is John's band. I saw them touring earlier this year. They're now on their second full-length album. I think they've got a couple of EPs as well and various singles. And, you know, they're doing all right. They're going out as a headline act. John's no longer the frontman. He's very much given in to Kitty, who's just a phenomenal icon, force of nature, really taken over as the principal songwriter and all of that. But even their sound has developed from something which was very sort of Nick Cave and Polly Jean Harvey to begin with, and morphed into something which was a bit more, I don't know, country blues, which has then gone into more out there their new metal style stuff. And yeah, I've really seen that develop. But if you put that in a block with John's earlier bands and kind of follow it through over a 20-year period, it's a remarkable history to just one artist, which I'm fortunate because I've known him so long. I'm able to sort of follow that through in, if I can get the right device, which will play these bloody awful RCDs, I can follow the whole lot through.
20 years, man. I mean, that makes a good friends for like 2 decades. But it's always been incredibly music orientated. And I think for a lot of people, you never really know what people do outside of your social interaction. A lot of us ask how work is going, but it's like, I compare it to the scene in Friends where they ask what Chandler's job is, and no one really knows. Outside of music, you're working like the archaeology field for over 2 decades again. It's astounding, mate. I mean, you're an actual doctor, for starters.
Yeah, I can't be the only doctor you've had on here. There must be somebody else with a stealth PhD somewhere. There are these musicians or musician-adjacent people, like Richard Hell, for example. He's got a PhD, which I wonder if it actually says Dr. Richard Hell or if he used his real name or whatever. But there are one or two out there. But yeah, I mean, I suppose I met you when I was starting to write about music, but also getting into promotion as well. And, it started with doing street teaming, which actually didn't last that long, maybe about a year or so, before we got the confidence to start putting on our own gigs, which kind of started slow, charity gigs and all that kind of thing. But pretty soon, because of the success of those, snowballed. And we started to find our confidence and all that kind of thing. But I suppose with most people, whether you be a musician or whether you be a promoter or whatever you are in the world of music, there probably is what you might call a day job, which is, in a sense, funding and supporting. And throughout the whole time I was involved in music, which actually was a relatively small period in my life, but I suppose for a lot of us was a hugely intense period. I was involved from 2003 to 2010, and a lot changed in that period of time, a huge amount. But during all of that period, I did keep a job in archaeology. So initially it was full-time, but by 2007, I'd really got the confidence because we'd had a lot of really successful events and tours, which was to the point where I was like, it's no longer sustainable to do these two things at the same time because the music was becoming full time and I just didn't have enough hours to actually dedicate to one or the other. And it was certainly non-sustainable to try and do both. So what I tried to do for a slightly smaller point was to actually drop my archaeology down to part-time hours. I was just doing it for 3 days a week. And then the music thing was probably 3 or 4 days a week. And there was lots of sneaky doing things while I was at work and all that kind of thing. Don't think I ever paid for printing, let's put it that way. And yeah, it almost worked. It absolutely almost worked. I almost got out of the sort of heritage sector. It almost worked. But then a whole sequence of things just collided. It's sort of difficult to unpick, but it was things like the credit crunch happened. There was a real changeover in the way that social media was used. It moved from MySpace to Facebook, and that left us very vulnerable because we could no longer reach those contacts that we had previously in those earlier iterations of social media. It just took us a long time to build that up. The venue that we were working at was gradually on the lead down to closing. And I think also a lot of the audience that we were reaching previously had grown up. A lot of these were, I don't want to use the word kids because that's really demeaning, but they were younger. We were seeing them coming through college and going off to university or meeting significant partners, sometimes getting married, just getting jobs, moving away. And so we no longer had that reach to our audience and things fell apart.
It was literally just that few year span where you either get in and hit it big or so. I mean, you timed it perfectly for the audience and stuff like that, but it is just a small window.
Yeah. I think also just personally, I just don't think I necessarily managed the business as well as I could have done. Because when it really started off, we were partying as hard as the bands were, without shadow of a doubt. And probably sometimes a lot harder than some of those bands as well. The tours became kind of like just a litany of debauchery and degenerate behaviour. And we were right in the heart of that. And,
That's not a business plan, mate. That one's on the business
No, it's
plan.
not a business plan. It was a lot of fun to begin with. But by kind of 2007, it was really getting out of control. And as I said before, like you're trying to build something up, but you're actually also undermining yourself as well with your own personal behaviour. So there was a lot of stuff going on, which meant that ultimately Riot Promotions didn't work. But also I think that even if we had taken away all of the nonsensical shambolic behaviour, and there was a fuck ton of that, I think even if we took all of that away, I just think that we as people were just not quite right for that moment to actually continue into the 2010s, because I think we were possibly listening to the wrong bands, in that we were picking the bands that we absolutely loved, but anybody with a bit more of a, what you might call a whole head for business would probably say that's probably not going to work. But we were giving it our all, giving it our passion, and maybe helping some of those bands to do as much. And certainly when we did start touching bands where we were thinking, right, well, we're going to book them for solid business reasons because they pull a lot, the fun went out of it. And I think the people that were still turning up to our gigs actually could sense that on some conscious or unconscious level.
It is like that unconscious level. It's like there's no pinpointing it. People just know sometimes.
Yeah, you can see in the way that a social media post is written, or in the glint in someone's eye, or the way that they talk about the music. All of a sudden it's gone from being actually this person is desperately in love with these bands and wants them genuinely to succeed, to this guy just needs to make 50 quid on this gig so he can afford to eat next week. And that desperation, actually, it puts people off. I didn't consciously ever use that as a promoter, that desperation, or please come to my shows, we really need you to, we'll have to close down, or, we need to eat next week. We never use that as a technique. But I did encounter other grassroots promoters who did do that. And I found that quite repellent and repulsive myself.
It's a very fine line.
Yeah.
People want to support, but cross it too much and people are like, oh, come on.
Yeah.
But you're putting all us band folk to shame, mate, in a couple of weeks as you head out on a book tour, which, if I'm right, it's already over 80 dates, right?
Yeah.
Fucking hell.
So, I kept the music thing going as long as I could, but then I knew when to say enough's enough. But it was probably about 18 months after the point where I should have canned it, really. But I eventually did do that, and I went off, and I lived in London for 6 years. So all of that music stuff was happening out of Nottingham, which is where we've come back to live.
For 6 years? Was it that long?
6 years in London, yeah. And that period really kind of focused my career in a way that would never have happened in Nottingham, the whole archaeology thing. I worked for basically the biggest archaeological company in Europe, which was the Museum of London Archaeology. And I met people who were really influential in the history of archaeology, people who'd been involved in really important excavations, like people like Julian Boucher, who was responsible for excavating the Rose and Globe Playhouses, which are places where William Shakespeare performed. These are really important landmark excavations with really significant, influential people involved in them. And it was meeting people like them, Sadie Watson, who was involved in huge amounts of excavating Roman London, or Natalie Cohen, who's involved with the National Trust, just meeting these people.
What did they make of you when they met you?
Well, it's difficult to know, because I was really quite frightened when I went to that job, because I was aware that this was a real big boys and girls organisation. And I'd been working in this sort of, not necessarily a backwater, but my career had been quite sheltered, working in local authority and working for little regional groups. But all of a sudden you're in this kind of maelstrom of really high-powered modern archaeology. And I think I was a little bit defensive, but also a little bit super scared to just make myself sound that I didn't know anything.
Was it like a musician, imposter syndrome?
Yeah. I think about imposter syndrome quite a bit. I don't really think I have it anymore. But I think at that period, because of being thrown into this world where there were all these really high-powered, well-known archaeologists, I just didn't want to appear to be that dickhead that didn't really know what he was doing. So for a little while, there was just this element of almost pretending that I knew what was going on when I clearly didn't, just because I didn't want to get found out, if you know what I mean, because they do things very differently in London to what they do in the regions. Just the way of digging things is completely different, because the archaeology is buried so deep that you excavate it in a different way. Just to give you an example of that, to get down to the early Roman layers, it's something like 12 to 16 meters in depth. I mean, that is just a huge amount of sort of cultural layers. And to get down through all that, you dig it in a different way to what you would do if you were out in a gravel quarry in the Trent Valley. The archaeology is just not buried nearly as deep there. It's just under the surface. So I was having to learn whilst on the job, whilst also thinking, well, hang on, I've been an archaeologist. At that point, I've been an archaeologist for about a decade. And just having that kind of but I don't really know what I'm doing down here, but I've been doing it a decade. I feel like I should know what I'm doing, and not wanting people to kind of cotton on to me, if you know what I mean. I wanted people to cotton on to the fact that I didn't quite know what I was doing. But there were some really nice people down there. There's a guy called Steve White, I'm still really, really good friends with. He's now quite high up at University College London. or certainly their archaeology wing. And he just sort of like was able to sort of take the edge off that for me. We got really similar backgrounds. And also he was really, really heavily into music as well. Not necessarily quite the same stuff as me. He was into the sort of more stoner end of things and the more metal end of things. But just that, having that connection, somebody that was into archaeology, was into music, and just liked to pint as well. So we really connected. And his partner, Jess Bryan, who's really well connected with the Prospect Trade Union, who are involved in looking after the sort of the world of archaeology. Again, somebody that was really into music as well. So meeting people like that really helped to give me wings when I moved down to London. But anyway, so I met all of these people in London. It really shaped up my career. It gave me experiences and working on sites that I could never possibly have had the opportunity to work on anywhere else. Like from that period, I've got places on my CV which include the Tower of London.
I mean, anyone around the world sees that, they'd be like, holy shit.
Yeah, the Palace of Westminster, it's the House of Commons, basically. I've worked there. Places like Knowle down in Kent, which is this great big medieval country house, which I ended up doing a project there, which as a collaboration, it ended up winning the best archaeological project at the British Archaeology Awards. So, stuff like that gives you confidence, essentially. It sort of shows you, well, actually, I do know what I'm doing. And, a lot of people are sort of very glib about awards and sort of say things, oh, it doesn't really matter. It's just the decision of that panel on that day. Or that kind of came for me at a time where things had got a little bit strange in my career, which, that's another matter entirely. And I just needed a little bit of a confidence boost. And that arrived at just the right moment. And it just helped me to step onto the next stage of my life, really. But yeah, so this has all sort of come about over those years. And last 5 years or so, I've been writing this book, which looks at commonly believed and repeated folklore about historic buildings.
Did it start as a blog?
Yeah, it did. I did a public lecture in Lincolnshire, and a historian friend of mine called Sharon Bennett Connolly turned up. She's written lots and lots of really, really good histories, which are often focused towards telling the female perspective in the past. And we were talking about how, there's just so many misunderstandings out there. And she was talking about misunderstandings about women in the medieval period. And I was sort of talking to her about how people tell stories about buildings that are palpably untrue, but we have to take with kind of a good-natured grace, because obviously training leads you to understand things in a great deal of depth. You can't take that high-handed, very sneering attitude, because it's just wrong. You've been privileged and fortunate enough to have that training and experience. You should use that more gently and more respectfully to try and explain to people that, well, actually, it didn't quite happen like this. And she sort of said, well, why don't you write a blog for my website? And I went, yeah, well, and so I did. And she contacted me a week later and said, well, whatever you've written, which is really good, she said, has clearly sparked people's imaginations, because she's never had that many posts that has had that many viewers before. And it was just like, well, hold on a minute. There's maybe something in this. And when the pandemic started, which was maybe about 6 months after I'd written that blog, I'd really lost all of my work and I wasn't getting any money from the government at all. I lost everything. It was real shit your pants time. Really scary. How can we make this work? Because by this point I was self-employed. I hadn't been self-employed that long either. And so I couldn't get any help at all from the government. We got about 2.5 months wages and that was it. And it was like, well, how long's this thing going to last? So I was thinking about different ways to diversify my income. And I thought about writing a book. I kind of started writing my own blog. And then that turned into this book. And the book comes out in June of 24. And yes, then I'm going out. And currently there are 81 dates on that tour. And it's everywhere from Edinburgh down to Pevensey, Sussex, and everywhere from Plymouth all the way across to Norwich.
Oh, mate.
Yeah. And there's still dates coming in, man.
I love it. This book, Historic Building Mythbusting. Whilst everything surrounding archaeology could be deemed as very proper, I was delighted to see one review claiming the book to be funny and occasionally filthy, which I was very happy to see.
That quote is from Richard Herring, the comedian, the stand-up comedian, who I've got to know a little tiny bit through Twitter. I've met him after shows and a couple of times. And funnily enough, next week I'm going on his podcast. He does a podcast called Rahelistaper, Richard Herring's Leicester Square Theatre podcast, which has been going, Christ, when did he start that? It might be 12 years, 15 years, something like that. It's been going a really long time.
He's an OG then, mate.
He is, mate. Well, I think one of the newspapers referred to him as the Podfather, which I think is a brilliant, brilliant name. Because I grew up watching his stuff on TV.
How nuts is that?
When I was at sixth form, him and Stuart Lee were doing Fist of Fun. And then when we got to university, it was him and Stuart Lee doing Good Morning with Richard, Not Judy. So for about 94 to 98, they were our go-to comedians. And it's just like, this is fucking weird, isn't it?
I'm working with Hugh Dennis from like Mary Whitehouse experience.
Well, yeah, exactly. So, yeah, Mary Whitehouse was just before then. So Mary Whitehouse was splitting up as Lee and Herring got going. Well, I mean, Lee and Herring had been going for years, but as they got going mainstream. So, yeah, I think Mary Whitehouse finished in 93, something like that. And Lee and Herring started in 94. And also going back actually before that, I've worked with Tony Robinson as well.
Time Team, yeah. Blackadder.
He's 80s.
Who's next, mate? You're building up a timeline.
Right. Yeah.
Who's still to check off the list?
Yeah. Greg Davis. That'd be a good one, wouldn't it?
There you go.
Let's go and work with Greg Davis.
There, it's out there now, mate.
He's mates with Richard, so it could happen. But much like yourself, he's had some legends, absolute legends on his podcast.
Legends in different fields, probably.
Yeah, but, I was thinking about this. I was thinking about who you've had on your podcast. And it's like, people I had posters of on my wall as a kid, people like Ginger and CJ from the Wild Arts and Desmond Child and like Stephen Piercy. And, it's like you've had these absolute legends on your podcast. And it's much the same with Richard. He's had Stephen Fry on there and Dave Gorman and, some really, really good entertainers and comedians and that. And yeah, for the two of you to ask this little old archaeologist on to natter about things that he might have observed about historic buildings, it's not necessarily daunting, but it does sometimes feel a little bit odd to be on these platforms. But I really love it. I'll talk to literally anybody with ears.
How long are you going to be away for on this tour?
Comes in waves, really. But the first bit of it is June and July. And I think it's 32 dates in June and July.
I love it.
So, yeah, it's pretty intensive.
You're just public transporting it all the time?
Yeah. No tour bus. No tour manager. No, nothing like that. It's just me on a train.
No laminates.
Not laminates, what, for me? I'll just point at the poster and like, it's my face up there. You're going to let me in or what? Yeah, I'm just going to be going around on the train, the occasional bus. Some people are giving me lifts and all that kind of thing.
Shit.
It's a bit beg, borrow and steal, a lot of it is, because, there ain't a lot of money in any of this. Royalties are pretty low, so that's not going to bring anything in.
Tour shit.
It's just a case of just calling in loads of favours. It didn't start off with this in mind at all. When I started booking this last Christmas, it was more like, there's a friend who's another archaeologist with a background in stonemasonry called Alex Woodcock. He's written some brilliant books as well. His book, King of Dust, it's more memoir than it is history of stone carving in the 12th century. It's really not that at all. It's kind of his memoir of a period in his life where he talks as much about Romanesque fonts as he does the Fields of the Nephilim and the Sisters of Mercy, which obviously really appealed to me. So he suggested to me, well, why didn't you do a modest book tour, 6 or 8 dates?
A modest.
And I thought, yeah, I'll be right that way. So I went away and thought, well, I'll book 6 or 8 dates, but I know what it's like trying to book tour dates. You send out 40 emails and you get maybe 3 or 4 gigs. So I sent out the 40 emails and something like 35 of them came back saying yes. So all of a sudden you're like, oh shit, I better do these gigs then. Then you start noticing places you're not going to and thinking, well, I should probably do a gig in that county. And, then you put the call out on social media and you're like, well, I haven't got a gig in like Norfolk was a big one for me. I couldn't get anything in Norfolk. And there's quite a bit of Norfolk in the book. Put the call out and it took quite a long time. And then one day, one afternoon, I ended up with 3 bookings in Norwich in 2 days. I'm not quite sure how that happened, but they all just came to me, literally.
All 3 of them going to happen?
Yeah, they're all 3 going to happen. And one of them sold out already. So it's like, I think they wanted me at the Castle Museum in Norwich. And then there was a talk at a pub in town in the evening. And then the next day speaking at a conference at the university about castles. And it was like, well, I wasn't expecting that because I was really struggling to get any gigs. Now I've got 3 in one weekend.
It's going to be like the Kiss Farewell tour. It's just going to keep rolling on and on.
Yeah. So it gets a little bit easier in the autumn where I'm going out, a bit less, but September and October, you're hitting literary festival season and all that. So there's a lot of literary and history festivals that come up then. And then it just keeps rolling on. And I've said that basically I won't accept any dates after like next May. So it'll go on for 1 full year. I'll accept dates where I'm sort of aware that if you throw enough gigs at the wall, if you know what I mean, you can work up an income. You know what I mean? It doesn't matter if you're being paid very, very little, because if you do it enough times, you can actually build up enough to pay the wages at the end of the month, because I've always got a weather eye on around that, to be honest with you, because self-employed, it's not like I can fall back into the arms of my employer like I did when I was a promoter and I had a shit gig. One of the things I used to say as a promoter was, you're only as good as your last gig. And, you know, if you've had a really, really good show or a really good tour where it brought in a few quid because it was popular and you hit the zeitgeist and plenty of people turned up, and occasionally we would have that. That's all brilliant, isn't it? But if you have a bunch of gigs where you just break even or worse, make a loss. And I do remember a time at the end of 2009 where I was sat in the Maze. Do you remember that venue in Nottingham at the top of Mansfield Road? I was sat in there on the door, and we booked a couple of bands, and I think 4 people had turned up and paid, and it was really bad. And it came at a period of about 3 months where everything I touched turned to shit, basically. You just couldn't get people through the door, even for bands that had been doing well or even went on to do well. There was just something in the autumn of 2009 where nothing worked at all.
That was a funny time period, actually.
Yeah, again, that's that crossover between your forums and message boards and MySpace and Facebook and Twitter taking off. And we kind of fell between the cracks, just couldn't get word out at all, and just sat in the Maze, just looking really glum and realising I hadn't got the money to pay anybody.
That's a horrible feeling.
Yeah. And I was earning okay in my day job still, but it was the case where it had just been gig after gig after gig where I'd had to take the long, lonely walk to the cash point to pay the artists. It was at the period as well where I was trying to re-establish or restart Riot Promotions. And it was a case that a lot of the old guard of bands had either split up or weren't necessarily pulling in the same way anymore. And so we were trying to diversify and find new acts to work with. And also trying to do this thing where I was working part-time. So again, I was booking bands I didn't necessarily love. This was one of those gigs, and I'd taken the long, lonely walk to the cash point a couple too many times. And so that night, there was nothing that came in on the cash desk. There was no advance ticket sales, and I had nothing, literally nothing in the bank. So I had to go and explain to everybody, look, you are going to get paid. I'll get paid for my day job, something like 4 days afterwards, and then you all get paid. But you can see it in people's eyes where they've heard that before from promoters and they haven't been paid. And, you know, in your soul, you know that that's happened to them, and you know how they are viewing this transaction, if you know what I mean, that you're just another one of those dickheads. Now, I never didn't pay anybody, ever. Everybody always got paid. And in fact, one of those bands on that gig, we ended up working with quite a bit after that. They had some decent shows out of us the following year before we canned it, and actually went on to play some pretty big gigs of their own. That was Sworn to Oath, who had kind of morphed out of a Stoke-on-Trent band called Headrush. Headrush were a very sort of Judas Priest, Guns N' Roses sounding hard rock band, and then Sworn to Oath became a very kind of Pantera sounding metal band and took a very different direction. But they went on to play some absolutely brilliant gigs, and we're still in touch with most of those guys to this day. But, you know, there was this conversation that was had that night in the Maze where it was just like, I can't pay you because I've got literally nothing and no access to any money. Everybody did get paid a few days later, but it was just a horrible, horrible experience to have. Can't quite remember how we got to this point in the conversation, but I hope I don't end up having that conversation on my own tour where I'm being bullshitted by promoters.
I imagine the show in Nottingham is going to be something of a standout and unique show on the tour. Will the remainder of the dates be able to compete, do you think?
Well, Nottingham, it's that old fear, really, isn't it? Well, I live here, so I should be able to bring people in, but there's that old fear that, yeah, but they might all have something better to do, or there might be something better on TV, or another gig will be attracting everybody. Ticket sales are doing all right, actually. We've got nearly 100 people.
Will there be snuff at the merch table?
Will there be snuff on the merch table? Yeah, that was one of the things we used to do quite a lot of, wasn't it? I suppose all of the other acts at that period were all on the nose cocaines and whatever, and we were just snorting up crushed up tobacco up our noses because it gave us a little bang for about 15 seconds. Yeah, snuff was a strange old period. So, yeah, I mentioned earlier, but Disarm, who were this great kind of feral...
And that's a good description.
Yeah, really odd group of guys, really, wasn't it? They were a lot of fun to be around, really young. And then manager, Kev Beatson, well, he's an ex-mining engineer in the late 70s, early 80s. And because you can't smoke in and around coal mines for obvious reasons, a lot of them took to snuff, which is, as I said before, crushed up tobacco. He kept on the habit even after he stopped being a miner and became, I think, an IT guy. I think that's what Kev does. We were going down to London in their van. It was a tour we did with Patchwork Grace and Zen Motel in, when did we do that tour? 2006 or 7, I think that one was. And it was 3 underground grassroots bands all out together, basically doing a couple of gigs or 3 gigs in regions where each band had a bit of a pull and sort of helping each other out. And we sort of coordinated and pulled the whole thing together and did all the logistics for it. To be honest with you, it was probably the most fun we had on the road, probably the best one we did. And it was pretty well attended too. But we were going down to London. Me and my wife, Michelle, were sat next to Kev Beatson, and he whips out this tin. He's doing about sort of 60 going down the motorway, whips out this tin. This great big hand goes into this tin, pulls out this dust, which he inhales. And he's like, his eyes are popping out of his head and that. And we're like, shit, he's just done a load of Charlie or whatever. And we're all about to die because he's off his tits. And it took us a little while to build up the confidence because we didn't know him that well at that point. I think we'd done 1 tour with him, but we didn't know him like super well at this point. It took a little while to build up the confidence to say, what was that? And he was like, oh, snuff, do you want some? I was like, yeah, go on then, I'll give that a go. And it was absolutely incredible. It gave us such a high. And then by the end of that tour, literally everybody on the tour was doing snuff. Literally everybody. On stage, off stage, in the van, in the hotels. It was just like, yeah, there was a bunch of us who were all aged. I think some of Patchwork Grace might have even been still teenagers at the time.
Oh, absolutely.
And probably, apart from Kev, probably the oldest. You know, Lee from Zen Motel might have been later 30s at that point. So yeah, what is essentially a bunch of kids all doing 1980s minus snuff.
Oh, mate. Just a bit of history. I mean, this book it's just a tiny part of everything you're about. Your love of archaeology, I believe it goes back to when you were like a young boy of like 5 or 6, growing up in Stone in Staffordshire. Quite appropriate name.
Yeah.
Watching old movies and then later finding out both your granddads served in World War II, I believe, which sparked an interest in history.
Somebody's been on Google, haven't they?
Was you like the odd one out at school, having like perhaps what could be considered a left field interest from that young?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, at primary school, I was pretty sociable and I played football and all that kind of stuff. And I had a fairly regular primary school experience, but I always had my nose in a book and I was asking mum and dad, can we go to this castle or that country house, or can we look at that cathedral or go to these Roman ruins or whatever? And that was probably a bit different, but I don't think I necessarily stood out at primary school because you don't really, you know, everyone's characters are still in development at that point, aren't they? But when I got to high school, yeah, definitely did stand out. When I was at high school, though, there was something else that kind of added to that sort of removal and that loner status, really. In that, in my second year at high school, I had an illness in my hip, which basically meant that my what I call the synovial fluids, which lubricate your joints, were trapped and kept away from the joint. So it was basically just bone on muscle, if you know what I mean. Very, very, very painful. And that took up most of my second year at school. So I was actually off school.
Dude, that's a big thing to happen.
Yeah, to happen. I think I was 12 into 13. So it's a really defining moment in an adolescence period, really. And when I got back to school, and I'd been off for maybe about 6 months or something like that, and then the summer holidays happened. So when I got back, everybody's voices had broken, you know, they got into different things, you know, and relationships had formed. And I hadn't seen anyone of my own age at all because I didn't have any brothers and sisters of my age. My brother's 10 years younger than me, so he was busy being tiny little boy. The only cousins that I have who were all older than me all live in Australia. So I hadn't seen anybody at all of my own age. And I just kind of stopped functioning. I closed into myself. And basically, I just spent the next few years literally with no mates at all, just going to classes, not really knowing how to communicate with anybody, shutting myself off from people, spending my lunch breaks in the library reading, just listening to music. And that was it. I just went to school, went home. And that went on really for about 3 or 4 years.
Did music become really important to you at that point then?
Yeah, hugely. Just buried myself in both music and history and archaeology, really. Also reading a lot of novels as well. It was around that time that I discovered Tolkien. So again, all of these things just sort of like mark you out.
Any escapism you was like grabbing hold of?
Yeah, it was more I didn't know how to deal with people because of that lengthy period of time. So I basically grew up with family, but obviously all older than me. And it was really not until I got to sixth form that I started to open up a little bit and properly socialising. But that just sort of opened the floodgate because I was like, oh, this is fucking great, isn't it?
Was that with like different people coming in or?
To an extent. Although, to be honest with you, the one person that I became particularly close to who ended up being best man at my wedding and was still really good mates to this day had been at school with me. It's just that we connected in a different way at that point, you know, for whatever reason. He he started getting me into slightly different music. Before that, I'd listened to a lot of, I suppose because I was spending time with family, I'd listened to pop stuff when I was younger, like really young. And then spending all this time with family, I was sort of listening to a lot of what they were listening to. So my granddad and my uncles and that kind of thing. And it was a lot of sort of jazz and blues and quite a bit of classical. And then my friend Tom Cosburn, now lives in Brisbane, he was getting his music collection from his older brothers. And so he was opening up my eyes to stuff like Bowie, The Mission, Def Leppard. I started to get into all of this stuff then. And then my uncle came over from Australia and he played me Thin Lizzy. And the world was never quite the same.
Really?
Yeah, it was never quite the same after he played me Thin Lizzy. Yeah, that started it all, really. That was the one that really broke. I'd heard stuff before, but that was the one that I really connected with.
Where were your first gigs at?
Well, I grew up in a really small market town, halfway between Stoke-on-Trent and Stafford. And again, because I didn't really know anybody that was going to gigs or anything like that, I was quite late before I was going to gigs. I can remember going to see stuff at the Victoria Hall in Hanley towards the end of sixth form with people. And I'm struggling to remember what that might have been, to be honest with you. So clearly it didn't make a huge impact, but it might have even been some tribute shows or something like that. I started going regularly to gigs when I got to university, though.
Was Nottingham a game changer for you?
Yeah, I think so. It was one of those things where I knew I needed to get out of the town and I wanted to go somewhere which was a bit more alive.
And this is mid-90s, right?
Yeah, mid-90s, yeah.
Quite a cool time, though, really.
Yeah.
Everything was all over the place, but kind of a cool time.
Yeah, I mean, musically, I suppose it was in that transition. Grunge, by that point, was over. I never really liked grunge, and I still don't really like grunge to this day. Hard rock was so dead. It had been sealed in lead. Coffin had been absolutely hammered shut, buried 12 foot, not 6 foot deep, all that kind of thing. Glam was completely dead. And yeah, it was about to all kick off again with bands like Book Cherry and that kind of stuff, which I was getting into too. But yeah, I was going to Rock City at a time where it was still a rock venue, in that they did rock nights as well as the bands coming through, which that's all gone now. Bands are coming through, but there aren't rock nights there. But I was getting quite heavily into the goth scene by that point. But again, looking back rather than forward, I think. So I was listening to a lot of the older bands like The Cure and the Nephilim, Bauhaus, Sisters, Mission, and those earlier acts. But because Nottingham had its own recording, it had Nightbreed Recordings, run by Trev Bamford, who's still a mate to this day. I was getting a little bit of a taste of some of the more contemporary bands. I remember there was one that I particularly liked who were called Malaise, who really touched a moment in the 90s for me, if you know what I mean. So yeah, Nottingham definitely livened me up to not just the sociability of the world, but also going and seeing bands at all levels, not just the bigger touring acts who were coming through and playing on the stage at Rock City, but also the grassroots venues as well, which is ultimately how we ended up finding you with Dip and Teenage Casket Company, because we were taking risks on going to see more grassroots acts, or at least seeing the support bands in those slightly bigger venues, and then thinking, well, actually, let's go and watch them when they come through in headline. And, you kind of get these tangential experiences where we ended up, I think what really got us into the world of promotion in 2003 was that I just mentioned that glam was deader than a dead thing in the mid to late 90s. But by the early 2000s, there was that whole kind of reform trail going on, wasn't it? And you saw bands like LA Guns coming back through, the Choir Boys had reformed, Dogs were reactivated, and you started to get a sense, oh, actually, there's a bit of a nostalgia circuit going. And we kind of noted that that was happening, but we hadn't necessarily been and watched any of those acts. And there came a point in sort of late 2002-3 where we were a bit like, well, if we don't, they'll probably all split up. We'll miss it all. So we started having this idea that we will actually go and watch some of these acts. And I seem to remember being in town and not having that much money, but thinking, oh, who's on at Rock City tonight? And it was Pretty Boy Floyd, who, I'll be honest with you, I'm still not really into, but they were playing.
Was this in disco too?
Yeah, it was. They were playing and we were just like, it's not very much. It was about £4 or something like that. It wasn't a lot of money. And we were just like, yeah, let's go. Let's give it a go. And, actually having quite a good time. They were quite a lot of fun because, as has been said before, their first album's an absolute banger. There are some brilliant party pop rock songs on there. And actually, we really enjoyed ourselves. But what really blew us away that night was seeing Robin Black and the Intergalactic Rock Stars, who were the sport.
I I was at that gig, mate.
Yeah, we didn't know you then, but you were at that gig. And just being completely blown away, again, by that really visceral nature of it, the fact that this was real. It was really snarly and aggressive and antagonistic, all while being wrapped up in these massive hooks and these just really kind of sci-fi lyrics and all this kind of thing. It just sort of feeling like this is a different way of looking at things and really getting into them. And then going and watching them do a headline set only a few days later, supported by new generation superstars, still pals of ours to this day, who we went on to work with, and then going and seeing them playing with other people, which is how we ended up meeting you and seeing Dip, but also getting into other bands that they were mates with too, people like Crash Kelly.
I'm going to say that was a magical time, however small that period of time was, for having all those Canadian bands to come to Junction 7 in Nottingham when everyone was at this particular age. There's loads of young kids coming up and stuff like that we mentioned earlier. They were so excited about it, finding the glam thing, and just a couple of years of like, holy shit, this is really frigging cool.
Yeah, there was a scene there which I felt at the time could have gone somewhere. It almost felt like it was embryonic. It felt like a lot of those gigs weren't that well attended.
Probably not. In our heads, they probably were.
We're talking like 30 or 40 people, something like that. A lot of those gigs were. But it was the same 30 or 40 people. And so it developed these networks of friendships, many of which are still more than active to this day. I went to see The Empty Page in Manchester last week, which is Kelly and Giz, who used to be obsessive compulsive. Now, I went to that gig with my friend Caroline, and we've been mates since that period in 2003-04, where we were trotting around the country watching Robin Black. And we've stayed friends, but we've developed this situation where we will go to gigs 2 or 3 times a year. Either she'll come over to Nottingham, we'll go to Manchester, or however it works. And there'll be a lot of discussing of the old days, but a lot of it will also be talking about new bands we've seen and who to recommend next, and then going and seeing them next and that kind of thing. It was nice to go and see Kelly and Giz with Caroline because obsessive compulsive had been an important part of the Riot Promotions story, if you like, and to see again their next move, which has gone into less of an overt metal sound and more into an alt rock sound, which I really like. And lyrically, Kelly's at the top of her absolute game right now. So again, that kind of scene which kind of spawned other acts and spawned friendships and led to this what you might call very amorphous world of connections, but became very important, really did drill down into a very short genesis, really, that kind of 2003-04, and then exploded, but not necessarily in the biggest way possible. Whether or not it's had any long-lasting impacts and legacies, I'm not sure, but there are still plenty of people who came out of that scene who are still performing, if you know what I mean. So to give a good example of that would be Evil Scarecrow, a Nottingham band. They did their first tour for us. The first time I ever saw them, there was 5 people in the room while they were playing. Well, 10 people actually, because 5 of them were on stage. There was the guy behind the bar, the sound guy. There was the guy doing the door, and then there was me and Richard Reeves from Leicester.
It was a gig then. It was.
And if me and Richard Reeves are there, it's a gig. Yeah. But Richard was one of those people, and still is one of those people that will support those bands, that will be there, will turn up, will be ecstatic to see the bands, regardless if anybody's actually in the room, will buy all of the merch, will go home happy, write about it, and tell everybody what a brilliant night he's had.
I have a vivid memory of Rich, well before we knew him at them Junction 7 gigs, when you used to have to go to the box office at Rock City and buy tickets. I have a vivid memory of him being in front of me in a queue with a list which he'd handwritten, and he handed it over, says, can I have tickets to all these gigs, please?
Yeah, I can't believe that. I've never heard that story before, but yeah, that rings true, because we'd be looking at the ticket sales, and it'd be just like, Rich Reeve, because he'd buy tickets to all of them on payday, and he still does that. You and I have said for many years, it's not a gig unless Rich is there. And the minute you see him, your face lights up because you just know that there's going to be at least one person down the front having the best time, punching the air, singing along, knowing all the words to not just the headliner, but all of the supports as well, because he's done his research. I maintain that if there were 20 Rich Reeves, we would still be in business with Riot Promotions. We wouldn't have had a problem. That's all it would have taken is 20 guys like him.
I love it. Tell us a little bit about the National Trust of Grassroots Music Venues. What's this?
Yeah, that's a little bit of a tangent, isn't it, mate? So this is a little venture where I'm still, in the sense, in connection with the world of underground music. During the pandemic, I got an email completely out of the blue from a guy called Jeremy Mills, who's a lawyer. He lives down in Dorset. And, you know, this doesn't sound like it's going to be a rock and roll story, if you like. But he contacted us completely out of the blue and he said, like, you seem like a busy person. And if you want something doing, ask a busy person to do it. Because although they haven't got time, they've probably got the energy to do it. And we ding-dong backwards and forwards with a few emails. But he had this wonderful notion for me that it was him and a few other people who were just really passionate about underground music, wanted to try and not just put something back, but actually offer something tangible to the world to keep it surviving. The idea was to set up something which, as Mark David from the Music Venue Trust refers to it as, would be like the National Trust for grassroots music venues. Namely, that there would be a kind of a group of people who would act together as like a board of directors who would purchase genuine grassroots music venues, independent venues, from their landlords. Now, the landlords are usually just commercial landlords who have no interest in grassroots venues, that they are charging very high commercial rents. The tenancies are often quite short, and so that it makes it really difficult for the tenants to actually plan for the future because they don't know if they're going to be in that building 12, 18 months hence. So as a result, the ecosystem that supports underground bands had been falling away. I think last year there was something like either 125 or 135 grassroots music venues had closed. It's in that kind of ballpark figure. It's a lot. And it's increasing. So every year it's getting worse. The environmental, as in the ecosystem of music venues, the system that it's in is in a kind of a tailspin. So our idea was to try and arrest that and to actually purchase these venues, reduce the rents to something which is reasonable, to actually put in money in terms of helping with the infrastructure of the venues, but also charging those reasonable rents. But again, to give long-term tenancies to people that we know are trustworthy and they can do the job. Now, it's still pretty early days. It took a couple of years before we were able to sort of get over the hill to make the purchase. But the way it's run is a kind of a collective of shareholders who actually donate money into the idea. And several of my friends have done this, as well as various artists, people who are involved in the wider ecosystem of underground music. But also there have been big funding bids to people like the Arts Council who've put money into it. The money has eventually poured in because people have seen quite rightly that if music is going to survive, it's this kind of grassroots project which will keep it going. So we've only currently got, I think it's just 2 venues at the moment, but it's going to be one of those things where we've got our eye on several venues. By the end of this year, we anticipate we'll have some more, and it will probably end up snowballing.
And the people like Frank Turner back in it.
Frank Turner's been a big supporter of this, and he's been a big supporter of Music Venue Trust as well, which is a separate organisation. But him and Mark David are thick as thieves, really, and they're always cooking up some wheeze. Like, he's just done his big 24-hour tour, hasn't he? 15-day tour in one day, which was absolutely nuts. But that was to kind of highlight the importance of grassroots venues, whilst also performing quite an entertaining stunt, I suppose, if you like. But yeah, there are all sorts of people who are very supportive of this, because I mean, a lot of people say, well, you know, there's tomorrow's festival headliners and tomorrow's arena headliners. You can't have those without the grassroots training ground, if you know what I mean. And that is definitely true, 100%. You know, there was a Music Venue Trust did this brilliant poster of the Reading Leeds lineup, and they took out all of the artists who had come up through grassroots, and you were left with about 4 artists, because everybody had come up through grassroots, and sort of pointing out, if you want Reading and Leeds, you've got to support this, because in 10 years' time, you won't have Reading and Leeds. And it's trying to wake up the big players to this idea to kind of support it. That's one way of looking at it. But the other way, and I think it's coming back down to what we were just talking about in terms of the scene as it was 20 years ago, and creating these ecosystems of friendships and bands who are supporting each other and going out on tour as a group of like-minded bands to kind of create this touring debauch shambles as it was back then, like we did with the Trash Talk tour. But people get an idea of that. They get an idea of the sense that this is actually going to be a lot of fun because those bands all really like each other and there's going to be really good rapport between them. But I think that in and of itself, that world, that grassroots scene is fine. That it doesn't have to be a training ground for festival headliners, that it can just be something which is there for itself because the audience are into it. It's supporting the local economy. It's supporting the venues. It's supporting local breweries. It's supporting chefs for the food that they eat before. It reaches out beyond its own limits. People are buying hotel rooms or Airbnbs or whatever. You know, it's creating this wider arena system. And that's fine. It doesn't have to be that those bands go on to play at the arena or a stadium or whatever. They can just stay at that level, and it's okay. I know every band wants to make it in a sense, but some bands don't necessarily, when they do make it, actually feel comfortable when they're up there.
All the best stories come at that grassroots level.
Yeah, exactly. But, you see so many bands who get up to that stratospheric level of headlining festivals and arenas. And take The Darkness, for example. They had a horrible time of it when they got up there. They'd come up properly grassroots, playing every shithole in the southeast, somehow made it really quick on the first album, automatically after that album came out, playing at all the big clubs. And then the year later, they were up in the, festivals and arenas, and had a horrible time of it. The second album suffered as a result, and when they bounced back down and finally kind of reformed themselves by 2011 or thereabouts, they kind of found their level, their comfort zone. And so many bands have been like that. The Wild Arts would be a good example of that as well, where they can afford a decent living, they can tour around, they can play some fine venues, they can keep releasing records, they can stay independent, but they're not having to answer all of those awkward questions that bands are, in a sense, compromised when they get to those higher levels. So, sometimes it's okay not to be right at the very top of the pile, that you actually, where you want to be is at those bigger club shows. Again, you can't get that without the grassroots. And sometimes it's all right to just be on the grassroots.
Mate, that's a lovely way of looking at it. I love it. Mate, we've rambled on for over an hour.
We have.
So, last question. I'm going to say it's archaeology related, as they're becoming lost artifacts. I want you to time travel to a Friday night in the late 80s or early 90s, before you moved to Nottingham.
Yeah.
You head into the video store, whichever the one was in your local town.
Yeah, can picture it.
What movie soundtrack do you have on your Walkman, and what 3 tapes are you going to rent for the weekend?
I mean, the first thing to say is if it was a Friday night, I probably wouldn't have been able to go to the video store anyway, because I would have been working in my dad's pub. Nice. Washing pots and serving tables and all that kind of thing.
How old was you when you started doing that?
About 13, way too young.
What was the pub called?
Pheasant Inn. It's still going as a pub. It closed for a little while, but it's still going in Stone. But this whole time machine angle of it, there's 2 ways of doing that, really, isn't there? You could go back and see what you were actually doing at that time. And then there's going back now as you are into the late 80s, early 90s, or probably more like early 90s, because I'm a little bit younger than you, and sort of answering what I would do now if I was in that period. And what I actually probably did, in terms of you asked this question about what soundtrack are you listening to, I can't really remember having many movie soundtracks. A lot of the music I had was stuff like the Now compilations, and then taped versions of my uncle's jazz or blues albums and that kind of thing. So I didn't really have much in the way of soundtracks, but one that I definitely did have, and I think I got this from the library on CD and copied it onto tape. It was a Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman film called Far and Away.
Wow, I wasn't expecting that.
Yeah, I had that. I know I had that soundtrack. I quite liked that kind of Celtic Irish thing in music at the time as well, which again is probably why when I properly started getting into hard rock, that Thin Lizzy resonated for me, because there's so much of that in there. And I don't think I've seen that film since the early 90s or whatever, but I know I had that soundtrack. So that might have been in the cans. In terms of films, thinking about what I was watching at that time, it was a lot of sort of high adventure and high drama, if you know what I mean. The James Bond films, so A View to a Kill would have been around that time. Definitely Highlander. And I know for a fact I'd had that from the local video store, which was just down at the end of the road. 100%. And when I was ill at sort of 12, 13, I'd really got into Tolkien. It's a little bit earlier than the 80s. It's from 1978, but Ralph Bakshire's Lord of the Rings.
Oh, the animated one?
Yeah, the animated one, which they never finished because its budget spiraled out of control.
That was like an 80s video staple. It's one you always saw in the video shop.
Yeah. So although it wasn't an 80s film, it was definitely something that I was watching at that time. But what I'd do now would be completely different. Yeah, if I went back in a time machine now and I only had access to what was available up to about, up to the point, I went to university in 96. So if we maybe looked at up to that point, the soundtrack would almost certainly be The Crow, almost certainly. So that's 94. So that's right at the end of your period of interest, isn't it? But it would almost certainly be, which has got my favourite Cure song on it.
30 years old, mate.
Yeah, it is, yeah. And being remade, of course. But it would definitely be The Crow soundtrack from that period. movie. In terms of films, it's still pretty mainstream, to be honest with you, what I would watch from that area. Number one would definitely be The Princess Bride, which I don't think I saw until probably about 95, 96 anyway. That was another one that bombed in the theatres, didn't it? And then it became a cult classic.
Filmed in our area as well.
Yeah, I suppose it was. Yeah, it was all filmed up in the Peak District, wasn't it? Hatton Hall and Castleton and Robin Hood Stride and that, yeah. Number two would, again, it's one that I saw a little bit after that time, but would be Withnail and I. Just an absolute banger of a film. So many quotable lines. And I've just been to see the stage play in Birmingham as well.
How was it?
There's no way it was ever going to be as good as the film. It was a bit lighter in its production. Like Withnail himself, there's a bit less of the darkness about his character. And Marwood seemed a little bit too peppy as well. But Danny was brilliant. The drug dealer. He was really good. And I think he got something of Ralph Brown's character in there as well. We enjoyed it a lot. We got fabulously drunk. It was brilliant. It was just fun hearing those lines delivered live. And you could really hear, like, when one of the classic quotable lines came up, the audience was laughing a lot louder, things like, here, here.
Is it going to be the new Rocky Horror thing, do you reckon?
I think it could be. That worried me when we went and saw it. That did worry me that it might become a quote-along. But that wasn't. People treated it respectfully. But the laughter on those certain lines was much bigger and much louder. Fork it! And such like, all the classic lines just got like big belly laughs. So yeah, Withnail and I would definitely be on the list. I'd probably have to put some sort of John Hughes Rite de Passage movie on there as my third choice. I was watching those at the time, but they probably didn't mean as much to me. I think it took me to get a little bit older and looking back at the meaning of those films. Stuff like Breakfast Club for sure. But last night I watched Ferris Bueller. I hadn't watched that in...
It still holds up, Ferris.
15 years, yeah. There's bits of it that I'd want to change, I think. Like, there's bits of it... I want to know more about Cameron. I wonder if more of his story was filmed and they had to chop it down.
Well, yeah, I think the original cut is about 3.5 hours long.
Is it? Right, yeah. I want to know more. I want to know more about his relationship with his parents. I want to see some of that. And also I want to see the conversation that he has with his dad after the car gets trashed. I want to see what that's like.
I don't know if I would. I love Cameron's return to Ferris, where Ferris says, I'll take the blame for it. And Cameron says, no, it's going to be all right.
Yeah.
I'll talk to him. We'll have that conversation.
Yeah.
I like how it just kind of ends at that.
I just want to see a bit more of that. For me, Cameron's the star of that one. He really is. He's the star turn. I didn't know you were going to ask me this question completely by accident, if you like. I'd sat down for my tea quite late last night. It was gone 10 before I sat down. And that was on our recorded films. And I was like, yeah, let's give that a go. It's probably 20 years since I've seen it. So it felt nice to sort of return to something that's so intimately linked with your straight-to-video project, if you like. And I think I did it unconsciously as well. I don't think it was a conscious decision. I knew I was doing this recording and therefore went for a John Hughes. Definitely not my favourite of his, but there's enough in there that it makes it an absolute classic, So yeah, those would be my three. The Princess Bride, Withnail. Don't know if it would be Ferris Bueller. It'd probably be more like The Breakfast Club, which is actually one of the things I always like on that. That is set on my birthday.
No way.
When the date comes up at the beginning, it's the 24th of March. So every year when that pops up on social media with people saying, it's the day that The Breakfast Club comes up, I'm like, yeah, and that's my birthday.
So good. Mint. Perfect way to end it, dude. I love it. James, thank you for chatting with me. I look forward to... I've got my tickets for the Nottingham gig.
Have you? All right, okay. That's good then. I'll have to put a nice shirt on. I might even wear trousers.
Oh, mate, don't spoil it. Massive thanks to James Wright for such a fun chat right here on the Straight to Video podcast. His new book, Historic Buildings Mythbusting, is available to pre-order now from all good book outlets or from thehistorypress.co.uk. And be sure to follow at JPW Archaeology on Twitter or X to keep up to date with all tour dates and ticket availability. If James's work with the Music Venues Properties campaign also sounds of interest, they can be found at musicvenueproperties.com. So that's all for this week's podcast, but I'll be back with a brand new episode next Friday. So until then, make sure to always be kind. Please rewind and unwind, and I'll speak to you all real soon.